What if the greatest military miscalculation in human history was hiding in plain sight for decades? What if historians, military strategists and scholars spent years analyzing the wrong turning points of World War II, while the true architect of Nazi Germany's destruction operated according to a flawed blueprint that everyone initially misunderstood? On June 22, 1941, over 3 million soldiers crossed the Soviet border in what would become the largest invasion force ever assembled. Operation Barbarossa unleashed a campaign of unprecedented scale and brutality, yet for years after the war's conclusion, this colossal undertaking remained shrouded in misinterpretation, its true significance obscured by Cold War politics, incomplete records, and the overwhelming shadow of other dramatic wartime events. The beaches of Normandy captured imaginations. The atomic bombs that ended the Pacific War generated endless debate. The Holocaust demanded moral reckoning. But Barbarossa, the operation that fundamentally sealed the Third Reich's fate, languished in relative historiographical neglect. The invasion of the Soviet Union represented far more than another aggressive expansion by Adolf Hitler's regime. It embodied the culmination of Nazi ideology, the ultimate test of German military doctrine, and the pivotal moment when the Second World War transformed from a European conflict into a genuinely global catastrophe. Yet understanding why this operation doomed Nazi Germany required historians to piece together evidence from multiple sources, overcome Cold War barriers to Soviet archives, and fundamentally reassess their assumptions about warfare, ideology, and the limits of military power. This is the story of how one of history's most consequential military operations was systematically underestimated, misunderstood, and overlooked, until scholars finally recognized it as the hinge upon which the entire war turned. It is a tale of archival discoveries, shifting perspectives, and the gradual realization that the Third Reich's destruction was set in motion not at Stalingrad, not at Normandy, but in the hubris-filled planning rooms where Operation Barbarossa took shape. Adolf Hitler's obsession with Lebensraum, or living space, formed the ideological cornerstone of Nazi Germany's expansionist ambitions from the movement's earliest days. Articulated in Mein Kampf and refined through years of political maneuvering, this vision demanded the conquest of Eastern Europe and the subjugation or extermination of its Slavic populations. The Soviet Union, with its vast territories and resources, represented not merely a strategic target, but the fulfillment of Hitler's racial and political worldview. To understand Operation Barbarossa requires understanding that it was never conceived as a conventional military campaign, but as an ideological crusade wrapped in strategic necessity. By the spring of 1941, Nazi Germany stood at the zenith of its power. Poland had fallen in weeks. France, the mighty military power that had resisted Germany for 4 years during the First World War, capitulated in a mere 6 weeks. The Low Countries collapsed before the Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg tactics. Norway and Denmark came under German control. The Balkans bent to Hitler's will. Great Britain stood isolated, weathering the Luftwaffe's aerial assault, but seemingly incapable of striking back at continental Europe. To many observers, both German and foreign, the Third Reich appeared invincible. Yet Hitler's position contained inherent contradictions. Germany lacked the economic resources for a prolonged global conflict. The nation's oil reserves remained dangerously inadequate. Its agricultural production could not sustain the population indefinitely without imports or conquest. The industrial capacity, while impressive, paled in comparison to the combined potential of the United States and Soviet Union should they become adversaries. Most critically, Germany faced enemies on multiple fronts, a nightmare scenario that had contributed to defeat in the previous World War. The Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939 had provided temporary relief from this strategic dilemma. By securing neutrality from Moscow, Hitler freed himself to concentrate on Western Europe. But this arrangement was always meant to be temporary in Hitler's mind. His hatred of Bolshevism matched his contempt for Slavic peoples. The pact represented pragmatic necessity, not ideological conversion. Moreover, Stalin's territorial acquisitions in Eastern Europe, his demands regarding Finland and the Balkans, and the Soviet Union's ominous military modernization convinced Hitler that conflict was inevitable. The only question was timing. In July 1940, even before the Battle of Britain concluded, Hitler directed his military staff to begin planning an invasion of the Soviet Union. This decision came at a moment when Germany still faced an undefeated Britain and when prudent strategy might have suggested consolidating gains, securing the Mediterranean or finding diplomatic solutions. Instead, Hitler chose to open a second front, launching an invasion that would require unprecedented logistical coordination, expose German supply lines to the vast distances of the Russian interior, and force the Wehrmacht to fight during the brutal Soviet winter. The planning for Operation Barbarossa revealed both the brilliance and fatal flaws of German military thinking. The operational concept called for a rapid advance on three main axes. Army Group North would drive toward Leningrad, Army Group Center would smash through Belarus toward Moscow, and Army Group South would conquer Ukraine and drive to the Caucasus oil fields. The plan anticipated destroying the Red Army in a series of massive encirclement battles near the border, then rapidly advancing to a line running from Arkhangelsk to Astrakhan before winter. Hitler and his generals believed the Soviet Union would collapse within 8 to 12 weeks, the military dissolving, the political system fragmenting, and the economic structure falling into German hands. This confidence rested on several assumptions. German intelligence dramatically underestimated Soviet military strength, particularly the Red Army's ability to mobilize reserves and reconstitute shattered formations. The purges of the late 1930s, which had decapitated Soviet military leadership, suggested an incompetent, demoralized armed force. The Red Army's poor performance in Finland during the Winter War reinforced these views. German commanders also assumed that Soviet infrastructure would facilitate rapid advances, that the population would welcome liberation from Stalinist oppression, and that the racial inferiority of Slavic peoples would manifest in battlefield incompetence. Every one of these assumptions proved catastrophically wrong, yet for decades after the war, historians struggled to identify precisely when and why these miscalculations emerged, how they shaped the campaign's execution, and why they proved so definitively fatal to the Third Reich. The reasons for this historiographical blindness reveal much about how we understand and misunderstand history. The significance of this oversight cannot be overstated. While popular consciousness fixated on dramatic moments like the Dunkirk evacuation, the Battle of Britain's aerial duels, or the D-Day landings, the truly decisive campaign of the entire war received comparatively little attention in Western historical discourse. This blind spot persisted, despite the staggering statistics that should have commanded attention. The Eastern Front accounted for approximately 80% of all German military casualties during the war. More than 4 million German soldiers died fighting in the East, compared to roughly 300,000 in the West. The scale of combat operations, the numbers of troops engaged, and the strategic stakes all dwarfed anything that occurred in other theaters. Understanding why this massive discrepancy existed between historical importance and historical attention requires examining the post-war environment in which World War II historiography developed. The victorious Western Allies naturally emphasized their own contributions to victory. British and American audiences wanted to read about their soldiers' experiences and sacrifices, not about distant battles fought by an ideological rival. The emergence of the Cold War within years of the war's end complicated matters further. Acknowledging the Soviet Union's decisive role in defeating Nazi Germany became politically awkward when the USSR transformed into the West's primary adversary. It proved simpler and more comfortable to focus on Western achievements while treating the Eastern Front as a separate, somewhat irrelevant conflict. The psychological dimension of this neglect deserves examination. Western audiences found the Eastern Front's scale and brutality difficult to comprehend. Battles where casualties numbered in the hundreds of thousands, where entire armies were encircled and destroyed, where cities were reduced to rubble and millions of civilians perished. These events exceeded the imaginative capacity of populations accustomed to smaller-scale conflicts. The Western Front of World War I had shocked a generation with its casualties, yet the Eastern Front of World War II dwarfed even those horrors. Faced with such overwhelming destruction, many historians and popular audiences simply turned away, focusing on more comprehensible narratives. The intellectual origins of Operation Barbarossa lay deep in German military and political thought. Generations of German strategists had worried about encirclement, about fighting simultaneously on Eastern and Western fronts. Bismarck's diplomatic genius had prevented this nightmare. Wilhelm II's clumsy policies had made it reality in 1914. Hitler, despite his contempt for traditional diplomacy, initially replicated Bismarck's achievement by securing Soviet neutrality. But his ideological fixations and strategic impatience drove him to deliberately recreate the two-front war that had destroyed the Second Reich. The German military establishment that planned Barbarossa embodied a peculiar mixture of innovation and conservatism. These were the officers who had pioneered combined arms warfare, who had perfected the blitzkrieg tactics that shattered Poland and France. They understood mechanized warfare's potential, the importance of air power, the value of operational mobility. Many had studied history extensively, learning from Napoleon's Russian campaign and the Eastern Front campaigns of World War I, yet they also carried biases and blind spots that would prove fatal. Chief among these was an inadequate appreciation for logistics. German operational planning emphasized the decisive battle, the bold stroke, the encirclement and destruction of enemy forces. This approach had worked brilliantly in Poland, where distances were manageable, and in France, where excellent roads and railways supported rapid advances. But the Soviet Union presented challenges of an entirely different magnitude. Roads deteriorated to muddy tracks during spring and autumn. Rail networks used a different gauge than European systems. Distances were vast beyond German experience, yet German planning gave insufficient weight to these factors, assuming that operational brilliance would overcome logistical realities. The logistical challenge can be quantified in stark terms. A single German panzer division required approximately 300 tons of supplies daily during active operations: fuel, ammunition, spare parts, food, and other necessities. Multiply this by the dozens of mobile divisions involved in Barbarossa. Add the needs of infantry divisions and support units, and the total requirement reached tens of thousands of tons daily. German logistics relied primarily on horse-drawn transport, with motorized columns reserved for priority shipments. The Soviet rail gauge difference meant that captured railways required conversion before use, a time-consuming process that left advancing forces dependent on increasingly extended road supply lines. The relationship between Hitler and his generals shaped Barbarossa's planning in complex ways. By 1941, Hitler had accumulated an impressive string of strategic and diplomatic victories. Against the advice of cautious generals, he had remilitarized the Rhineland, annexed Austria, dismembered Czechoslovakia, and gambled on attacking France through the Ardennes. Each time his intuition had proven correct, while professional military advice had been overly conservative. This track record inflated Hitler's confidence in his own judgment and diminished his respect for military expertise. Yet the generals themselves shared responsibility for Barbarossa's conceptual flaws. Franz Halder, the Army Chief of Staff, enthusiastically embraced the invasion plan. Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, Commander-in-Chief of the Army, raised no fundamental objections. Field commanders like Heinz Guderian, Erich von Manstein, and Fedor von Bock anticipated victory and competed for the glory of capturing Moscow or Leningrad. The entire military establishment convinced itself that German superiority would prevail despite the odds. This confidence drew on recent successes, but also on deeper cultural assumptions. German military culture prized the offensive spirit, the bold attack, the decisive engagement. It venerated commanders like Frederick the Great and Moltke the Elder, who had achieved stunning victories through aggressive action. This tradition made it psychologically difficult for German officers to advocate caution or to acknowledge fundamental strategic limitations. Admitting that Germany lacked the resources for a successful invasion of the Soviet Union would have required abandoning core professional identities and challenging deeply held beliefs about German military supremacy. The ideological dimension further complicated rational planning. Operation Barbarossa was never intended as a conventional military campaign. It was conceived as a war of annihilation, a racial struggle for Germany's survival. Hitler explicitly demanded that the invasion be conducted with unprecedented brutality. The Wehrmacht would not merely defeat the Red Army, but would facilitate the destruction of Bolshevism and the enslavement or extermination of Eastern Europe's population. Special SS formations followed the advancing armies, murdering Jews, communists, and others deemed racial or political enemies. Millions of Soviet prisoners of war would be deliberately starved to death. Entire cities would be razed or left to perish from starvation. This criminal dimension was not incidental to Barbarossa, but central to its conception. Yet it also undermined the campaign's military effectiveness. By conducting the invasion as a war of annihilation, Germany guaranteed that the Soviet population would resist with desperate ferocity. Potential allies among populations oppressed by Stalin were alienated by Nazi brutality. Resources that might have been used for military logistics were diverted to mass murder. The ideological fanaticism that made Barbarossa inevitable also ensured its failure. For years after the war, these connections remained obscured. German generals writing memoirs blamed Hitler's interference for Barbarossa's failure, while downplaying their own enthusiastic participation and the campaign's criminal nature. Cold War politics made thorough investigation of Soviet archives impossible. Western historians focused on the war against the Western Allies, relegated Barbarossa to secondary importance. The full picture emerged only gradually as documents became available, as eyewitness accounts accumulated, and as scholars began asking different questions. The personnel involved in planning Barbarossa represented the cream of German military talent, yet they collectively failed to grasp the operation's impossibility. General Friedrich Paulus, who would later surrender at Stalingrad, helped draft the initial invasion plans. His meticulous staff work produced operational schemes of impressive sophistication, accounting for troop movements, supply requirements, and tactical objectives. Yet these plans rested on the fundamental assumption that Soviet resistance would collapse quickly, an assumption that contradicted available intelligence and historical precedent. Intelligence failures compounded planning deficiencies. German military intelligence, the Abwehr, systematically underestimated Soviet military capabilities. Estimates suggested the Red Army could field approximately 200 divisions. In reality, the Soviet Union mobilized more than 600 divisions during the war's course. German intelligence failed to identify the existence of entire Soviet armies, misunderstood Soviet industrial capacity, and remained ignorant of the depth of Soviet strategic reserves. These failures stemmed partly from the closed nature of Soviet society, but also from confirmation bias. German analysts interpreted ambiguous evidence in ways that supported their preconceptions about Slavic inferiority and communist incompetence. The technological dimension revealed similar patterns of overconfidence and misunderstanding. German armor and tactics had proven superior in Poland and France. The Panzer Division's combination of tanks, motorized infantry, and close air support had revolutionized warfare. Yet these successes occurred under specific conditions that would not exist in Russia. Western Europe's road network supported mechanized operations. Distances were manageable. Climate was temperate. The Soviet Union offered none of these advantages. The vast spaces would disperse German mechanized forces. Poor infrastructure would limit mobility. Extreme climate would stress equipment and personnel. German planners recognized these challenges intellectually, but failed to appreciate their cumulative impact. Soviet tank design illustrated German intelligence failures, with consequences extending throughout the campaign. German planners knew the Red Army possessed large numbers of tanks, but dismissed them as obsolete and poorly employed. The appearance of the T-34 medium tank and KV-1 heavy tank shocked German forces. These vehicles, entering service just before Barbarossa began, proved superior to German tanks in armor protection and firepower. The T-34 in particular combined excellence in multiple dimensions: sloped armor, powerful armament, wide tracks for cross-country mobility, and mechanical reliability. Its existence demonstrated that Soviet industrial design was far more capable than German prejudices acknowledged. The human dimension of planning revealed the most profound failures. German planners viewed Soviet soldiers through the lens of Nazi racial ideology, expecting them to collapse when faced with Aryan superiority. This racist contempt prevented realistic assessment of Soviet fighting qualities. In reality, Soviet soldiers fought with extraordinary tenacity, even when poorly led and inadequately equipped. The defense of Brest Fortress, where a garrison held out for weeks despite being bypassed and cut off, foreshadowed the resistance German forces would encounter throughout the campaign. Individual Soviet soldiers might surrender when faced with impossible situations, but units fought to destruction rather than retreat, buying time at terrible cost for mobilization to occur deeper in the Soviet interior. The failure to understand Soviet society and political system compounded military miscalculations. German planners anticipated that Stalin's regime would collapse under military pressure, that national minorities would rebel, that the population would welcome liberation. These assumptions reflected both wishful thinking and profound ignorance. While Stalin's rule was indeed brutal and unpopular in many regions, the Nazi invasion triggered nationalist resistance rather than internal collapse. The Soviet regime, despite its many failings, proved capable of mobilizing society for total war in ways that surprised and ultimately overwhelmed German expectations. Stalin's leadership, often caricatured as incompetent by German propaganda and later Western accounts, demonstrated crucial strengths despite terrible errors. His decision to remain in Moscow during the October 1941 crisis steadied Soviet resistance at a critical moment. His ruthless prioritization of military production over civilian welfare enabled the industrial mobilization that sustained the war effort. His willingness to appoint capable commanders like Georgy Zhukov, despite their political unreliability, provided the Red Army with leadership it desperately needed. These qualities do not excuse Stalin's crimes or his catastrophic errors in the war's early stages, but they help explain how the Soviet system survived the initial onslaught. The initial phase of Operation Barbarossa seemed to confirm German expectations. On June 22, 1941, the Wehrmacht struck with overwhelming force. Soviet border units were devastated. Thousands of aircraft were destroyed on the ground. German armored spearheads drove deep into Soviet territory, encircling massive formations of Red Army troops. Within weeks, German forces captured hundreds of thousands of prisoners and advanced hundreds of miles. Army Group Center approached Smolensk, Army Group North neared Leningrad, Army Group South drove into Ukraine. Yet even in these early victories lay the seeds of ultimate defeat. The pocket battles that the Germans won so decisively took longer to liquidate than planned. Soviet units fought with unexpected ferocity, delaying German advances even when encircled and doomed. The primitive road network slowed logistical support. The vast distances stretched supply lines beyond their effective limits. German motorized units began experiencing maintenance issues that could not be quickly resolved. The Luftwaffe, despite its initial successes, found itself spread too thin across the enormous front. Most critically, the Red Army refused to collapse. German intelligence had estimated that the Soviet Union could field perhaps 200 divisions. In reality, the Soviets mobilized far more. As German forces destroyed Soviet formations near the border, new armies appeared further east. Stalin's decision not to retreat wholesale, but to contest every advance bought crucial time at terrible cost. The Soviet system, despite its brutality and inefficiency, proved capable of extraordinary mobilization. Factories were dismantled and moved beyond the Ural Mountains. Reserves were called up. A nation was transformed into an armed camp. The encirclement battles of 1941 illustrated both German operational brilliance and the campaign's fundamental problems. At Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev, and Vyazma Bryansk, German forces executed classic double envelopments that trapped hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers. These victories seemed to validate blitzkrieg doctrine and German superiority. Yet each pocket required weeks to reduce consumed German resources and delayed the advance toward strategic objectives. The trapped Soviet forces, though doomed, continued fighting, tying down German units needed elsewhere. This pattern repeated throughout the summer and autumn, with German forces winning tactical victories that could not be translated into strategic success. The German strategic dilemma crystallized in August 1941. Army Group Center, having driven to Smolensk, prepared to advance on Moscow. But Hitler redirected forces southward, seeking to encircle Soviet armies in Ukraine and secure agricultural and industrial resources. This decision sparked furious debate among German commanders. Those focused on operational considerations argued that Moscow's capture would decapitate Soviet command, disrupt rail communications, and deliver a psychological blow that might trigger collapse. Hitler, thinking strategically and ideologically, insisted on securing Ukraine's resources and destroying Soviet forces before advancing on the capital. The decision's wisdom remained debated for decades. The Kiev encirclement that resulted from Hitler's strategy destroyed massive Soviet forces and opened Ukraine to German occupation. Yet it consumed weeks of campaigning season and cost the Wehrmacht irreplaceable time. When Operation Typhoon, the drive on Moscow, finally launched in October, the autumn rains had begun, turning roads to mud and slowing the advance. By the time German spearheads reached Moscow's suburbs in December, the Soviet winter had arrived. Soviet reserves had been rushed to the capital's defense, and the Wehrmacht's offensive power was exhausted. The Rasputitsa, the seasonal mud that transforms Russian roads into impassable quagmires, exemplified the environmental challenges German planners had underestimated. For weeks during autumn and spring, mechanized operations became nearly impossible. Vehicles bogged down. Supply columns halted. Infantry slogged through mud that could reach knee-deep. German forces, accustomed to Western Europe's maintained road networks, found themselves paralyzed by conditions Soviet forces had learned to anticipate and accommodate. This seasonal phenomenon, predictable and unavoidable, should have factored prominently in operational planning, but received insufficient attention. The failure to capture Moscow before winter represented a strategic catastrophe from which Germany never recovered. The Red Army launched a counteroffensive in December that drove German forces back, inflicting the Wehrmacht's first major defeat. More importantly, the failure demonstrated that the campaign's fundamental assumptions were false. The Soviet Union would not collapse. The Red Army could reconstitute itself. The Russian winter was indeed a formidable adversary. The distances were indeed too vast. German logistics were indeed inadequate. The Soviet winter counteroffensive of December 1941 caught German forces unprepared in multiple dimensions. Troops lacked adequate winter clothing and equipment. Vehicles and weapons malfunctioned in extreme cold. Supply lines stretched to breaking point could not provide necessary material. Meanwhile, Soviet forces, equipped for winter operations and benefiting from interior lines of communication, struck with surprising strength. Fresh divisions from Siberia, released after intelligence confirmed Japan would not attack from the east, spearheaded attacks that drove German forces back from Moscow's gates and shattered the aura of invincibility surrounding the Wehrmacht. Yet even as Operation Barbarossa ground to a halt in the winter of 1941-1942, its full implications remained unclear. German forces still occupied vast territories. The 1942 summer offensive towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus suggested that Germany retained offensive capacity. The Wehrmacht demonstrated remarkable resilience, recovering from the Moscow defeat and launching new attacks. Soviet casualties were astronomical, seemingly unsustainable. To many observers, the war's outcome remained uncertain. Understanding why Barbarossa doomed the Third Reich requires moving beyond operational narratives to examine fundamental strategic realities. Germany had failed to achieve its operational objectives in 1941, but more importantly, it had committed itself to a conflict it could not win. The invasion triggered a race between German capacity to exploit conquered territories and Soviet capacity to mobilize resources and manpower. This race was one Germany was always destined to lose. The economic dimension proved decisive. Germany's pre-war economy, while impressive, lacked the industrial depth necessary for a prolonged war against major powers. The Nazis had pursued rearmament, but had not fully mobilized civilian economy for war production until 1943. The territories conquered in 1941-1942 provided resources, but also demanded garrisons, administration, and security forces. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, despite losing huge territories, retained the ability to outproduce Germany in tanks, aircraft, and artillery. The factories beyond the Urals churned out weapons in quantities that shocked German intelligence. The statistics tell a stark story. In 1942, the Soviet Union produced 24,000 tanks compared to Germany's 9,000. Soviet aircraft production exceeded 25,000 compared to Germany's 15,000. Artillery production showed similar disparities. These figures reflected not just greater resources, but also more effective mobilization. The Soviet system, for all its brutality and inefficiency in peacetime, proved remarkably effective at total war mobilization. Every resource was directed toward military production. Labor was conscripted ruthlessly. Standards of living plummeted as everything went to the front. This total mobilization, sustained by Allied aid and by resources beyond German reach, created a material superiority that German tactical skill could not overcome. The comparison between German and Soviet economic mobilization reveals fundamental differences in approach and capability. Germany, despite fighting a total war, maintained relatively high civilian consumption levels until late in the conflict. Luxury goods continued production. Consumer services remained available. The Nazi leadership, fearful of domestic unrest, avoided demanding the total sacrifices that total war required. Albert Speer's appointment as armaments minister in 1942 rationalized production and increased output. But these improvements came too late and fell short of what total mobilization might have achieved earlier. The United States' entry into the war following Pearl Harbor compounded Germany's strategic impossibility. Now the Third Reich faced not just Soviet industrial capacity, but also American production, which dwarfed all European powers combined. Lend-Lease aid began flowing to the Soviet Union, supplementing its own production with trucks, aircraft, and supplies that enhanced Red Army mobility and effectiveness. Germany fought against an alliance that controlled more population, more resources, and more industrial capacity than the Third Reich could ever match. American Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union totaled approximately $11 billion worth of materiel during the war, a staggering sum equivalent to roughly $150 billion in current dollars. This included over 400,000 trucks, 13,000 armored vehicles, 11,000 aircraft, and vast quantities of food, raw materials, and industrial equipment. While Soviet production dominated in tanks and artillery, American vehicles provided mobility that Soviet industry could not match. Soviet offensives after 1943 relied heavily on American trucks for supply and transport, enabling the sustained operations that drove German forces westward. The human dimension was equally important. Operation Barbarossa unleashed unprecedented brutality. The Wehrmacht's complicity in war crimes, the deliberate starvation of Soviet prisoners, the participation in or facilitation of Holocaust operations in occupied territories, and the brutal occupation policies guaranteed that the Soviet population would resist with desperate determination. Partisan movements disrupted German rear areas. Every Soviet soldier knew that surrender might mean death. This made the Eastern Front a war of annihilation for both sides, where surrender was rare and casualties were catastrophic. German casualties mounted relentlessly. The Wehrmacht bled experienced soldiers and officers it could not replace. By late 1942, German divisions on the Eastern Front operated at reduced strength. The quality of replacements declined. Meanwhile, the Red Army learned from its defeats, developing competent commanders, improving tactics, and building operational capabilities. The vast human resources of the Soviet Union allowed it to sustain casualties that would have destroyed any Western nation, while Germany's smaller population and multi-front commitments made every loss irreplaceable. The transformation of the Red Army from the shambles of 1941 to the formidable force of 1943-1945 represented one of military history's most remarkable achievements. This evolution occurred through brutal experience, ruthless discipline, and systematic learning. Incompetent commanders were removed, often executed. Successful ones received rapid promotion. Tactics were refined based on battlefield experience. The rigid, top-heavy command structure gradually gave way to more flexible methods that allowed initiative at lower levels. By 1943, Soviet operational art had evolved to match or exceed German capabilities in many dimensions. The development of Soviet deep battle doctrine illustrated this evolution. Early in the war, Soviet attacks were often frontal assaults that suffered catastrophic casualties. By 1943, the Red Army had mastered operational-level warfare, coordinating multiple armies across broad fronts to achieve deep penetrations. The Soviet emphasis on artillery, which Western observers sometimes mocked, proved devastatingly effective. Massive artillery barrages pulverized German defenses before infantry and armor attacked. The sheer volume of firepower compensated for tactical deficiencies and inflicted casualties German forces could not sustain. Soviet artillery doctrine evolved into a science of destruction. The Soviets developed methods for massing thousands of guns and rocket launchers to deliver overwhelming firepower on narrow front sectors. The Katyusha rocket launcher, while less accurate than conventional artillery, delivered devastating saturation bombardments that suppressed German defenses and shattered morale. Soviet artillery planning achieved sophistication matching German operational planning, with carefully timed barrages supporting precisely orchestrated infantry and armor attacks. By 1944, Red Army offensive operations began with artillery preparations of such intensity that German defenders were often neutralized before ground assault began. Soviet logistics also improved dramatically. Initially, the Red Army's logistical organization was chaotic, contributing to early disasters. By 1943, Soviet logistics had become remarkably effective, moving enormous quantities of supplies across vast distances. American Lend-Lease trucks proved crucial to this improvement, providing mobility that Soviet industry could not match. These trucks allowed Soviet forces to sustain offensive operations over extended periods, maintaining pressure that prevented German forces from stabilizing defensive lines. The transformation extended to Soviet air power. In 1941, the Luftwaffe had achieved air superiority with relative ease, destroying thousands of Soviet aircraft on the ground or in unequal aerial combat. By 1943, Soviet aviation had grown into a formidable force. New aircraft designs like the Yak-9 fighter and Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack plane proved effective. Soviet pilot training improved. Numerical superiority became overwhelming. The Luftwaffe, spread across multiple fronts and suffering from fuel shortages, could no longer dominate the Eastern Front's skies. Soviet ground forces increasingly operated with air support, while German forces endured constant aerial attack. The Il-2 Sturmovik deserves particular mention as a weapon that came to symbolize Soviet air power. Heavily armored and carrying powerful weapons, the Sturmovik attacked German ground forces with devastating effectiveness. Produced in greater numbers than any other combat aircraft in history, over 36,000 manufactured, the Sturmovik provided close air support that German forces could neither match nor counter effectively. Its combination of survivability and firepower made it the Eastern Front's most feared ground attack aircraft, inflicting terrible casualties on German armor and infantry. These material and organizational improvements occurred despite the Soviet Union's inherent disadvantages. The loss of territory in 1941-1942 had cost the USSR its most productive agricultural and industrial regions. Ukraine's fertile fields, the Donbas industrial basin, the factories of Leningrad's region, all fell under German occupation. Yet the Soviet system's ruthless mobilization extracted production from remaining resources. The relocated factories beyond the Urals, operating in harsh conditions with inadequate housing and supplies, nonetheless produced the weapons that sustained the war effort. This achievement came at enormous human cost, with workers laboring under conditions that would have been intolerable in Western nations. But it demonstrated capabilities German planners had never imagined. The partisan movement represented another dimension of Soviet resistance that German planners had not anticipated. As German forces advanced in 1941, they left vast rear areas inadequately garrisoned. Partisan groups, some organized by the Soviet state, others spontaneous, began operations against German supply lines, railroads, and isolated garrisons. Initially ineffective, the partisan movement grew increasingly sophisticated and destructive. By 1943, partisan operations in Belarus and Ukraine tied down substantial German forces and inflicted significant casualties. The brutality of German occupation policies, far from intimidating the population into submission, drove recruits to partisan bands and created a hostile environment that consumed German resources without producing corresponding benefits. Partisan warfare in the occupied Soviet territories reached a scale unprecedented in modern warfare. Estimates suggest that over 1 million individuals participated in partisan activities at some point during the occupation. These forces conducted thousands of operations, derailing trains, ambushing convoys, destroying supplies, and gathering intelligence. German anti-partisan operations consumed divisions that were desperately needed at the front. The security situation in occupied territories never stabilized, forcing Germany to maintain large garrison forces that contributed nothing to offensive operations while suffering steady attrition from partisan attacks. The ideological dimension of partisan warfare reinforced Soviet resistance. Nazi racial policies left occupied populations no middle ground between collaboration and resistance. Unlike in Western Europe, where occupation policies sometimes allowed for accommodation and varying degrees of collaboration, in the East, Nazi ideology demanded treating entire populations as subhuman enemies destined for enslavement or extermination. This eliminated any possibility of stable occupation or genuine collaboration, guaranteeing that German forces faced hostile populations throughout occupied territories. Historians' gradual recognition of Operation Barbarossa's decisive importance revolutionized understanding of World War II. This shift required several breakthroughs. The opening of Soviet archives after the Cold War's end provided unprecedented documentation of Red Army operations, Soviet decision-making, and the scale of mobilization that sustained the war effort. German documents, thoroughly examined over decades, revealed the extent of Wehrmacht complicity in atrocities and the degree to which ideological fanaticism shaped operational decisions. Economic historians quantified production figures, resource flows, and logistical capabilities, demonstrating the material impossibility of German victory. Perhaps most importantly, scholars began asking different questions. Instead of focusing narrowly on operational decisions, they examined grand strategy. Instead of treating the Eastern Front as separate from the wider war, they recognized its centrality. Instead of accepting German generals' self-serving accounts, they interrogated assumptions and examined underlying causes. This broader perspective revealed that Operation Barbarossa was not simply a military campaign that failed, but a strategic catastrophe that made German defeat inevitable. The recognition that Barbarossa doomed the Third Reich rested on several key insights. First, the invasion committed Germany to fighting simultaneously on multiple fronts, the nightmare scenario German strategists had sought to avoid. Once the Blitzkrieg failed and the war in the East became a protracted struggle, Germany lacked the resources to prevail. The Wehrmacht could win tactical victories, conduct brilliant operational maneuvers, and inflict terrible casualties, but it could not overcome the fundamental disparity in resources and industrial capacity. Second, the invasion's ideological character ensured maximum enemy resistance while undermining potential advantages. Had Germany conducted the invasion as a conventional military campaign, it might have exploited anti-Stalin sentiment, secured cooperation from occupied populations, and reduced the ferocity of Soviet resistance. Instead, Nazi racial ideology demanded treating Slavic populations as subhumans, destined for enslavement or death. This guaranteed that the conflict would become a struggle for survival, mobilizing every resource of Soviet society against the invaders. The treatment of Soviet prisoners of war exemplified this criminal stupidity. Over 3 million Soviet prisoners died in German captivity, most from deliberate starvation and exposure. This represented both a moral catastrophe and a strategic blunder of the first magnitude. These prisoners could have provided labor for German industry or agriculture, relieving manpower shortages. Better treatment might have encouraged defection and undermined Soviet morale. Instead, German policies created martyrs and strengthened Soviet determination to resist. The few Soviet citizens who initially welcomed German forces as liberators from Stalin quickly learned that Nazi occupation offered only death or slavery. The General Plan East, the Nazi blueprint for reconstructing Eastern Europe, revealed the regime's ultimate intentions. This document envisioned depopulating vast territories, exterminating or expelling tens of millions of Slavs, and settling the empty lands with Germanic colonists. Surviving Slavic populations would be reduced to illiterate slave laborers serving German masters. This genocidal vision, while partially concealed during the war, shaped occupation policies and guaranteed maximum resistance. Any population facing extermination fights with desperate ferocity, transforming what might have been a manageable occupation into an ongoing security nightmare. Third, the economic calculations underpinning Barbarossa were fatally flawed. Germany invaded to secure resources necessary for continuing the war, particularly oil from the Caucasus and agricultural products from Ukraine. But exploiting these resources required controlling vast territories, maintaining long supply lines, and administering hostile populations. The costs of occupation consumed much of what conquest provided. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union retained enough industrial capacity beyond German reach to sustain the war effort indefinitely. German planners had gambled that a quick victory would make economic calculations irrelevant. When that victory proved elusive, Germany faced a war of attrition it could not win. The failure to capture Soviet oil fields proved particularly devastating. Germany's oil shortage became acute by 1943, limiting training for pilots and tank crews, constraining operational options, and forcing reliance on synthetic fuels that were inadequate and vulnerable to Allied bombing. The Caucasus oil fields that Barbarossa sought to capture remained in Soviet hands, while Romanian production proved insufficient for German needs. This resource constraint alone might have been insurmountable, but combined with other shortages and the demands of multiple fronts, it sealed Germany's fate. German synthetic fuel production, while impressive technologically, never approached the quantities needed. The hydrogenation plants that produced synthetic gasoline from coal required enormous investments and resources. Allied bombing targeted these facilities with devastating effectiveness, repeatedly disrupting production. By 1944, fuel shortages constrained German operations across all fronts. The Luftwaffe grounded aircraft not from lack of planes or pilots, but from lack of aviation fuel. Panzer divisions remained immobile. Strategic options vanished as Germany's mechanized forces literally ran dry. Fourth, the invasion triggered American entry into the war. While Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor provided the immediate cause, Hitler's declaration of war on the United States stemmed from his confidence following early victories in Russia. This decision created a global coalition against Germany that possessed overwhelming advantages in population, resources, and industrial capacity. Fighting simultaneously against the Soviet Union, the British Empire, and the United States was simply impossible for Germany, regardless of tactical brilliance or operational skill. American production capacity transformed the war's material balance. The United States produced more than 300,000 aircraft during the war, more than 80,000 tanks, millions of trucks, and countless other vehicles and weapons. Much of this production went to Britain and the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, multiplying their capabilities. American industrial might turned the conflict into one Germany could not possibly win once the United States fully mobilized. The decision to declare war on America represented strategic madness, yet it flowed logically from Hitler's worldview and his confidence that Barbarossa would succeed before American power could deploy. Hitler's declaration of war on the United States remains one of history's most puzzling decisions. Germany had no treaty obligation to support Japan after Pearl Harbor. American attention was focused on the Pacific. A cautious leader might have avoided giving the United States cause to enter the European war. Instead, Hitler gratuitously declared war, bringing America's full power against Germany. This decision, made at a moment when the offensive against Moscow was faltering and winter was setting in, demonstrated the strategic irrationality that characterized Nazi leadership. Ideology and emotion trumped calculated self-interest, with catastrophic results. Recognizing these factors required historians to move beyond chronicle and analysis to synthesis and systemic thinking. It demanded acknowledging that wars are won not just on battlefields, but in factories, farms, and mobilization centers. It required understanding that ideology shapes strategy in ways that can prove fatal. It necessitated recognizing that the Wehrmacht, despite its tactical excellence, served a regime whose criminal character and strategic incompetence doomed it to defeat. This recognition transformed the historiography of World War II. Earlier accounts had often treated Stalingrad as the war's turning point, the moment when German fortunes reversed. Later scholars recognized that Stalingrad was a consequence, not a cause, the logical outcome of strategic impossibilities created by Barbarossa. Others had emphasized D-Day and the Western Front's liberation, but while these operations were crucial to ending the war, they occurred only after Barbarossa had made German defeat inevitable. The Eastern Front consumed roughly 80% of German military casualties and the vast majority of Wehrmacht combat strength. Understanding this front's centrality required understanding Barbarossa's pivotal role. The implications extended beyond military history. Barbarossa's failure revealed the limits of military power when divorced from economic reality and political wisdom. It demonstrated that tactical excellence cannot overcome strategic impossibility. It showed that ideological fanaticism produces strategic blindness. These lessons resonated beyond the specific context of World War II, offering insights into how nations stumble into unwinnable wars and how hubris clouds judgment. The comparative dimension illuminated these lessons. Napoleon's 1812 invasion of Russia had failed for reasons remarkably similar to those that doomed Barbarossa. Vast distances, hostile populations, scorched earth tactics, and brutal winter weather had destroyed the Grande Armée despite tactical brilliance and operational success. German planners knew this history, yet convinced themselves that modern technology and supposed racial superiority would produce different outcomes. This hubris exemplified how ideology and recent success breed strategic blindness. The parallels between Napoleon's campaign and Barbarossa extend beyond superficial similarities. Both invasions featured brilliant initial advances that penetrated deep into Russian territory. Both achieved spectacular tactical victories that failed to produce strategic results. Both stretched supply lines beyond sustainable limits. Both encountered populations that refused to accept defeat. Both culminated in catastrophic retreats that destroyed the invading armies. That German planners, aware of these parallels, nonetheless repeated Napoleon's errors, demonstrates how powerfully ideology and overconfidence can distort strategic judgment. The delayed recognition of Operation Barbarossa's decisive importance raises troubling questions about historical understanding and collective memory. Why did it take decades for scholars to recognize what in retrospect seems obvious? How did such a massive, consequential military operation remain in historiographical shadow while smaller campaigns received disproportionate attention? What does this blindness reveal about how societies remember and interpret their pasts? Several factors contributed to this historiographical neglect. Cold War politics created barriers to comprehensive research. Soviet archives remained closed, restricting access to crucial documentation about Red Army operations, Stalin's decision-making, and Soviet mobilization efforts. Western historians, unable to access these sources, focused on topics where documentation was available. The Iron Curtain that divided Europe also divided historical understanding, with Eastern and Western historians working in isolation, unable to synthesize their findings into comprehensive narratives. The ideological dimensions of the Cold War profoundly shaped historiography. Western scholars found themselves in an awkward position regarding the Eastern Front. Acknowledging Soviet achievement in defeating Nazi Germany required praising the war effort of a regime that had become the West's primary adversary. The heroism and sacrifice of Soviet soldiers had to be recognized while simultaneously condemning Soviet communism. This tension led many Western historians to minimize the Eastern Front's importance, focusing instead on Western Allied operations, where no such ideological complications existed. Cultural and political biases also played roles. Western audiences were more interested in the war against the Western Allies, the Battle of Britain, D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, than in the distant, brutal conflict on the Eastern Front. The emergence of the Soviet Union as an adversary during the Cold War made emphasizing the Red Army's decisive role politically awkward. It was simpler and more comforting to focus on Western contributions to victory while treating the Eastern Front as a separate, almost irrelevant theater. German generals' memoirs contributed to misunderstanding. Officers like Heinz Guderian, Erich von Manstein, and Franz Halder wrote influential accounts that blamed Hitler for Barbarossa's failure while portraying the Wehrmacht as a professional force hamstrung by political interference. These narratives downplayed military leadership's enthusiastic participation in invasion planning, minimized the campaign's criminal dimensions, and suggested that victory was possible but for Hitler's errors. Western audiences, eager for insider accounts and unconsciously sympathetic to professional soldiers who fought bravely in a losing cause, often accepted these self-serving narratives uncritically. The memoir's influence on historiography cannot be overstated. Works like Guderian's Panzer Leader and Manstein's Lost Victories became foundational texts for understanding the Eastern Front. These accounts emphasized operational and tactical details while deflecting responsibility for strategic failures onto Hitler. They portrayed the Wehrmacht as a noble institution forced to serve an evil regime, a narrative that absolved professional officers of complicity in the Third Reich's crimes. This clean Wehrmacht myth persisted for decades, only gradually being dismantled as historians examined documentary evidence rather than relying on participants' accounts. Manstein's memoir proved particularly influential. His reputation as perhaps the Wehrmacht's most brilliant operational commander lent authority to his accounts. His descriptions of Eastern Front battles became standard references for military historians. Yet his memoir systematically minimized Wehrmacht involvement in atrocities, blamed Hitler for all strategic failures, and portrayed German officers as professionals doing their duty under difficult circumstances. Only later research revealed the extent to which Manstein and other commanders had been directly complicit in war crimes, had enthusiastically supported invasion planning, and had shared responsibility for strategic decisions they later blamed entirely on Hitler. The sheer scale of Eastern Front combat also hindered understanding. Battles involving millions of combatants stretched across hundreds of miles overwhelmed comprehension. The astronomical casualties, roughly 27 million Soviet deaths, including at least 8 million military deaths and 4 million German military deaths on the Eastern Front, stunned the imagination. Western historians, accustomed to analyzing campaigns where casualties numbered in thousands, struggled to make sense of losses measured in millions. The result was often to treat the Eastern Front as a meat grinder, a savage struggle whose details were less important than the overall pattern of attrition. This tendency to view the Eastern Front as mere attrition rather than a complex military campaign with sophisticated operational art on both sides represented a form of intellectual avoidance. The scale was too vast, the brutality too extreme, the suffering too immense for easy comprehension. It proved simpler to reduce the conflict to generalizations about endless Russian reserves and German tactical skill than to grapple with the actual military, political, economic, and moral complexities involved. As archives opened and new generations of scholars emerged, these barriers gradually fell. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 opened previously inaccessible archives. Russian historians, freed from ideological constraints, produced nuanced accounts that acknowledged Soviet failures alongside victories. German historians confronted Wehrmacht complicity in war crimes. Western scholars began treating the Eastern Front not as a sideshow but as the war's decisive theater. Economic historians quantified production and resource flows, revealing the material basis for Soviet victory and German defeat. This historiographical evolution paralleled broader changes in how World War II was understood and remembered. The focus shifted from celebrating victories to understanding the war's total character, its ideological dimensions, and its criminal conduct. The Holocaust moved from periphery to center in historical consciousness. The sufferings of Eastern European populations, previously overlooked, received attention. The complexity of resistance and collaboration in occupied territories was explored. These shifts enabled more comprehensive understanding of Operation Barbarossa's role. The evolution in Holocaust studies proved particularly important for understanding Barbarossa. Initial post-war accounts often treated the Holocaust as separate from military operations. As documentation emerged and survivors testified, scholars recognized that genocide was integrated with military campaigns, particularly in the East. The Einsatzgruppen murder squads followed directly behind advancing Wehrmacht units. German military authorities provided logistical support, security, and sometimes direct participation in mass killings. Understanding Barbarossa as a war of annihilation required confronting these criminal dimensions, not treating them as unfortunate side effects, but as central to the campaign's conception and execution. Yet even as understanding improved, questions remained. Could Germany ever have won in the East? Might different strategic choices have produced different outcomes? These counterfactual questions sparked vigorous debate. Some argued that without Hitler's interference, professional military leadership might have captured Moscow in 1941, potentially triggering Soviet collapse. Others contended that regardless of operational decisions, the fundamental strategic impossibilities, Germany's inadequate resources, Soviet mobilization capacity, the invasion's ideological character, made defeat inevitable. The weight of evidence supports the latter view. Every plausible alternative scenario confronts insurmountable obstacles. A single-minded drive on Moscow in 1941 would have left massive Soviet forces on the flanks, threatening supply lines and potentially encircling the advancing Germans. Securing Ukraine and the Caucasus before advancing on Moscow consumed time that allowed Soviet mobilization. Treating occupied populations humanely would have required abandoning core Nazi ideology, essentially demanding that Germany not be Nazi Germany. Avoiding war with the Soviet Union would have left Germany resource-starved and vulnerable to Soviet attack when Stalin chose. The Moscow scenario deserves particular attention as it represents the most common counterfactual. Proponents argue that capturing the Soviet capital in 1941 might have decapitated Soviet command, disrupted communications, and delivered a psychological blow, triggering collapse. Yet this scenario faces multiple problems. Moscow's capture would not have destroyed Soviet industrial capacity beyond the Urals. It would not have ended the war, as the Soviet government could have relocated and continued resistance, as indeed it prepared to do. German forces, even if they captured Moscow, would have been exhausted, overextended, and vulnerable to counterattack. Most critically, capturing Moscow would have required German forces to fight through multiple defensive lines manned by fresh troops, all while extending supply lines to their breaking point and facing the onset of winter. In essence, Operation Barbarossa represented the logical culmination of Nazi ideology and German strategic culture. The invasion was not an aberration, but the fulfillment of Hitler's worldview. Its failure stemmed not from correctable errors, but from fundamental contradictions between Nazi ambitions and achievable reality. Recognizing this requires acknowledging that the Third Reich's defeat was not contingent on specific decisions, but was overdetermined by the regime's character, ideology, and strategic choices. This recognition carries implications beyond historical understanding. It suggests that ideologically driven regimes pursuing irrational goals will fail regardless of tactical competence. It demonstrates that military excellence cannot overcome strategic impossibility. It reveals how hubris and ideology produce blindness to reality. These lessons remain relevant in understanding how nations stumble into catastrophic decisions despite warning signs and contrary evidence. The contrast between Nazi Germany's assessment of its capabilities and actual reality illustrates cognitive biases that transcend specific historical contexts. Confirmation bias led German leaders to emphasize information supporting their assumptions while dismissing contradictory evidence. Overconfidence built on recent successes blinded them to fundamental differences between previous campaigns and the Soviet invasion. Cultural prejudices about Slavic inferiority prevented realistic assessment of Soviet capabilities. Ideological fanaticism made it psychologically impossible to acknowledge that core goals were unachievable. These patterns appear repeatedly in history. Nations underestimate adversaries, overestimate their own capabilities, and pursue goals beyond their reach. The United States' involvement in Vietnam exhibited similar patterns of hubris and misassessment. The Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan demonstrated comparable strategic blindness. More recent conflicts have shown that technological superiority and tactical excellence cannot guarantee strategic success when fundamental political and economic realities are ignored. Operation Barbarossa also illuminates the relationship between morality and strategy. The invasion's criminal character was not incidental, but central to its conception and execution. Yet this criminality directly undermined military effectiveness. The brutality that Nazi ideology demanded guaranteed maximum enemy resistance, alienated potential allies, diverted resources from military purposes, and created security challenges that consumed German forces. In this sense, evil was not merely immoral but also stupid, strategically counterproductive, as well as morally reprehensible. This connection challenges simplistic distinctions between ethics and effectiveness. It suggests that criminal conduct typically undermines strategic goals, that moral constraints often align with strategic wisdom, and that regimes pursuing fundamentally immoral objectives will likely fail. While this is not a universal law, injustice sometimes succeeds in the short term. It points toward a deeper truth about the relationship between means and ends, between the character of political systems and their strategic outcomes. The question of historical contingency versus determinism finds particular expression in Barbarossa's analysis. Was German defeat inevitable once the invasion began, or did specific decisions and circumstances determine the outcome? The evidence suggests limited contingency within broader deterministic constraints. Individual battles might have ended differently. Operational decisions might have produced varied outcomes, but the fundamental strategic impossibilities limited the range of possible outcomes. Germany might have conquered more or less territory, inflicted greater or fewer casualties, prolonged the war slightly more or less, but could not have achieved sustainable victory given the resources available and enemies faced. The story of Operation Barbarossa and its belated recognition as the decisive campaign of World War II illuminates how we understand history and why that understanding matters. For decades, one of the war's most consequential operations remained in historiographical shadow, its true significance obscured by Cold War politics, incomplete documentation, and cultural biases. The gradual recognition of Barbarossa's pivotal role required opening archives, questioning assumptions, and synthesizing evidence across military, economic, and political dimensions. What emerged from this scholarly evolution was a fundamentally revised understanding of World War II. The conflict's outcome was decided not at Stalingrad, though that battle was crucial, nor at Normandy, though that operation was essential to ending the war. The decisive moment came when 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border on June 22, 1941, beginning a campaign that committed the Third Reich to a war it could not win against an enemy it had fatally underestimated in pursuit of goals that ideology demanded but reality denied. Operation Barbarossa doomed Nazi Germany because it forced the Reich into a multi-front war against opponents with vastly superior resources. It failed because German planning rested on false assumptions about Soviet military capacity, political stability, and economic vulnerability. It became a catastrophe because Nazi ideology demanded conducting the invasion as a war of annihilation, guaranteeing maximum enemy resistance and alienating potential allies. Most fundamentally, it was doomed from conception because the Third Reich lacked the economic, demographic, and industrial resources necessary for conquering and occupying the Soviet Union. The implications of this understanding extend beyond World War II history. Barbarossa demonstrates how ideologically driven states pursue irrational goals despite overwhelming evidence of impossibility. It reveals how recent successes breed overconfidence that blinds leaders to changed circumstances. It shows how cultural prejudices distort threat assessment and strategic planning. It illustrates how tactical excellence cannot overcome strategic impossibility. These lessons remain urgently relevant in understanding why nations make catastrophic decisions and how such disasters might be avoided. The delayed recognition of these truths also speaks to the challenges of historical understanding. Complete comprehension requires time, access to documentation, freedom from political constraints, and willingness to question comfortable narratives. The Cold War environment that initially obscured Barbarossa's significance reminds us that contemporary political concerns shape historical interpretation in ways that distort understanding. The gradual opening of archives and emergence of new scholarship demonstrates that historical knowledge is provisional, always subject to revision as new evidence emerges and new questions are asked. For those who lived through the events, the significance was often clearer than it was to later historians. Soviet citizens understood that the Nazi invasion was an existential threat demanding total mobilization. German soldiers who fought in the East recognized that they faced an enemy and environment unlike anything they had previously encountered. Allied leaders watching from abroad realized that the Eastern Front would determine the war's outcome. But transforming lived experience into scholarly consensus required decades of research, debate, and synthesis. The Eastern Front's centrality to World War II can no longer be disputed. The statistics are overwhelming. 80% of German casualties occurred there. The vast majority of combat operations took place there, and the decisive strategic outcomes emerged from there. Yet this centrality took decades to achieve proper recognition in Western historiography, delayed by Cold War politics, limited archive access, and cultural preferences for more familiar narratives. Today, Operation Barbarossa stands recognized as the decisive campaign of World War II, the operation that doomed the Third Reich and determined the conflict's outcome. This recognition has fundamentally reshaped understanding of the war, highlighting the Eastern Front's centrality, acknowledging the Soviet Union's crucial role in defeating Nazi Germany, and revealing the Third Reich's strategic bankruptcy. It has also illuminated the complex interplay between ideology, strategy, economics, and military operations in determining war's outcomes. The lessons of Barbarossa echo across time. They warn against ideological fanaticism that distorts strategic judgment. They demonstrate that military power divorced from economic reality and political wisdom courts catastrophe. They reveal that hubris born of recent success breeds disasters when circumstances change. They show that tactical competence cannot overcome fundamental strategic impossibilities. They illustrate that criminal conduct typically undermines its own goals. These insights transcend their specific historical context, offering guidance for understanding how nations stumble into catastrophe and how such disasters might be recognized and avoided. The campaign's legacy extends beyond military lessons to moral and philosophical dimensions. The coupling of military operations with genocide, the deliberate starvation of millions, and the brutalization of entire populations revealed the Third Reich's true character. These crimes were not unfortunate byproducts of war, but central to Nazi ideology's implementation. Understanding Barbarossa requires grappling with this moral dimension, recognizing that the campaign was not merely a strategic blunder, but a criminal enterprise that rightfully failed. The moral dimension cannot be separated from the strategic. Nazi Germany's defeat resulted not from moral justice operating in history, but from the practical consequences of criminal policies. Yet these consequences were not accidental. Policies of extermination and enslavement guaranteed maximum resistance. Racial contempt produced intelligence failures. Ideological rigidity prevented strategic adaptation. In this sense, the Third Reich's evil directly contributed to its defeat, not through divine intervention, but through the predictable results of criminal stupidity. In the end, Operation Barbarossa represents one of history's great cautionary tales, a story of ambition unmoored from reality, of ideology trumping reason, of hubris preceding catastrophe. The fact that its significance was initially overlooked serves as a reminder that understanding history requires constant vigilance, intellectual humility, and willingness to question received wisdom. The eventual recognition of Barbarossa's decisive importance demonstrates that patient scholarship and honest inquiry can eventually illuminate even the most obscured truths. For historians, the evolution of Barbarossa's historiography offers methodological lessons about the importance of accessing diverse sources, questioning assumptions, and synthesizing evidence across multiple dimensions. For general audiences, it provides insight into why World War II unfolded as it did, and why Nazi Germany's defeat, while purchased at terrible cost, was ultimately inevitable. For all who study the past seeking wisdom for the present, it stands as an enduring reminder that the most consequential events are sometimes the most initially misunderstood, and that the patient work of historical scholarship serves essential purposes in illuminating truth and extracting meaning from even the darkest chapters of human experience. The 3 million soldiers who crossed the Soviet border that June morning could not have known that they were marching toward the Third Reich's doom. The operations planners, confident in German superiority and blinded by ideology, could not recognize the fundamental impossibility of their task. Even historians studying the campaign decades later initially failed to grasp its decisive significance. But gradually, as evidence accumulated and understanding deepened, the truth emerged. Operation Barbarossa did not just fail, it doomed the regime that launched it, sealing the fate of Nazi Germany and determining World War II's outcome. The recognition that Barbarossa was the decisive campaign transforms our understanding of the entire war. It reveals that the conflict's outcome was determined not in the dramatic moments that captured popular imagination, but in the grinding, brutal struggle on the Eastern Front. It demonstrates that the Third Reich's defeat stemmed not from any single decision or battle, but from fundamental strategic impossibilities created when ideology drove Germany to invade a nation it could not defeat with resources it did not possess for goals that were unachievable. This understanding honors the millions who perished in the campaign, acknowledging that their suffering and sacrifice determined history's course. It recognizes the Soviet Union's crucial role in defeating Nazi Germany, a recognition often obscured by Cold War politics, but essential to historical accuracy. It reveals the Wehrmacht's complicity in criminal conduct, demolishing the myth of a clean, professional military forced to serve an evil regime. Most importantly, it provides lessons about the dangers of ideological fanaticism, strategic hubris, and the pursuit of unachievable goals regardless of cost. The human cost of Barbarossa defies comprehension. 27 million Soviet citizens perished, military and civilian, combatant and non-combatant, victim of battle and victim of deliberate murder. 4 million German soldiers died in the East. Entire cities were destroyed, populations were displaced, economies were shattered. The physical and psychological scars persisted for generations. Understanding Barbarossa requires confronting these costs, recognizing that the campaign's failure was purchased with suffering on a scale that challenges moral imagination. Yet from this suffering emerged the destruction of one of history's most evil regimes. The Third Reich's defeat, while costly beyond measure, ended a system committed to genocide and enslavement. Had Barbarossa succeeded, Nazi Germany would have implemented the General Plan East, exterminating or enslaving tens of millions. The campaign's failure, therefore, represented not just military defeat, but the prevention of even greater atrocities. This does not redeem the suffering or justify the costs, but it places them in context of what was at stake. Recognizing these truths, understanding why they were initially overlooked, and learning the lessons they offer remains essential work for anyone seeking to understand how and why nations rise and fall, how hubris breeds catastrophe, and how patient inquiry eventually illuminates even history's most obscured truths. Operation Barbarossa stands as history's terrible teacher, demonstrating that the greatest military machines can shatter against the rocks of strategic impossibility, that ideology can blind even brilliant minds to reality, and that the patient work of understanding the past remains essential to avoiding its worst mistakes in the future. The final lesson of Barbarossa may be this: history's most important turning points are not always immediately recognized. The decisive moments, the choices that determine outcomes, the operations that seal fates, these often become clear only in retrospect, after archives open, after passions cool, after patient scholars piece together evidence and construct comprehensive narratives. Operation Barbarossa was the decisive campaign of World War II from the moment it began, but recognizing this truth required decades of historical work. This reminds us that understanding the past is an ongoing process, that today's certainties may become tomorrow's revisions, and that humility and open-mindedness remain essential virtues for anyone seeking to comprehend how and why history unfolded as it did.